Trump is very used to being the outsider. He ran in 2016 as a Washington outsider, even though he's an incredibly wealthy man. He posed himself as the outsider taking on the political establishment. And in 2020, he kind of ran on that same line again. It wasn't successful. But he had more of a chance of maybe positioning himself as an outsider against someone like Joe Biden, who's obviously has been a politician for over 5 decades. He can't really do that with Kamala Harris, and it seems like he's maybe struggling to kind of fight a campaign where he's on the defensive and he's having to be the one defending his own record.
Go right. Let's speak to Anthony Blair, senior reporter for The Sun in the US, who's been at the DNC as well. Anthony, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning.
Describe what it was like then being in the room. There's lots of applause. Obviously, it's a friendly audience. They are supportive of Kamala Harris and her nomination, etc. What was it like being there?
I mean, as you say, the energy has been incredibly high all week. It has felt almost more like a sporting event than a political conference. A lot of energy and yeah, I mean, a lot of excitement. I think, Kamala is someone, despite having been, vice president for the past 4 years, it feels like a lot of people don't really know her, even within her own party, let alone the American public. So this felt like this speech was her trying to kind of almost introduce herself to the public and to the voters, and also to some in her own base that maybe didn't know a lot about her a week ago.
I think that's interesting because this is clearly the biggest platform she's had to do these things, to tick those boxes, I suppose. And there's an interesting part of that, isn't there? Because there is an introduction required to people around the US, but there will also be something of a reintroduction. It's been noted that lots of what she's been saying thus far, including in her speech last night, might be considered familiar to those who were closely following her presidential bid in 2020, focusing on her upbringing in San Francisco's Bay Area, raised by a single mother from India, etc. So some of that, those who are very into it and are Harris fans may have heard before.
Yes, and obviously she was, she wove in a lot of details of her upbringing into her speech quite well. But as you say, it's kind of interesting that she's talking about bringing change when people could quite rightly turn around and say, well, you've been the second most important person in the country for the past 4 years. Why didn't you bring this change then? But saying that, she does seem to have kind of played that quite well. She paid an early tribute to Biden. But then very quickly kind of moved on and, focused her speech on, we are bringing the change that the country so desperately needs.
To what extent was this a standard campaign speech? Does it stand apart from what she's been saying on the trail?
I mean, my view was that this was very much a speech that she was giving to undecided voters. We heard a lot of quite tough talk on immigration and on the economy, and there were quite almost conservative coded moments, such as bringing up the veterans on stage. We heard speeches from cops, from even Republicans, and we didn't really hear any of the kind of playing to the base stuff that we may have heard a bit earlier in the week. And certainly, having been at the RNC in Milwaukee last month, that was very much a convention that was playing to the MAGA base. And when we were talking to people and attendees in Milwaukee, they were very, very keen on JD Vance, and he was very much a MAGA candidate. This felt like a speech that, and the whole kind of mythology that's been built around, Coach Tim Walz being a football coach, a veteran, they're trying to maybe not fall into the trap that the Democrats could fall into on some of these issues that are more divisive and that have the potential to turn off a lot of undecided voters.
That's interesting. So let's consider then more about the strategy, because there's a consideration here, isn't there, that what we heard there about from Harris calling out Trump once again seems to have sent the Republican presidential nominees campaign in something of a, well, maybe tailspin is too strong, but we keep sort of making this point. Does Donald Trump know how to deal with, to respond to Kamala Harris? And perhaps there is something to be said for the vagueness of her policy platform just now. It doesn't open the door to Trump teeing up lines of attack.
Yes, I mean, as you say, we heard very little detail in the speech tonight. I think that's fair to say. And throughout the speech, Donald Trump has been live posting on his Truth Social app, kind of condemning almost point by point, giving us a blow by blow coverage of what he thinks that Kamala is saying wrong in her speech. But on that point, it does feel like there's a kind of I suppose, it's it's hard to know how Trump responds. I think Trump is very used to being the outsider. He ran in 2016 as a Washington outsider, even though he's an incredibly wealthy man. He posed himself as the outsider taking on the political establishment. And in 2020, he kind of ran on that same line again. It wasn't successful. But he had more of a chance of maybe positioning himself as an outsider against someone like Joe Biden, who's obviously has been a politician for over 5 decades. He can't really do that with Kamala Harris, and it seems like he's maybe struggling to kind of fight a campaign where he's on the defensive and he's having to be the one defending his own record.
Anthony, really good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Anthony Blair there, the Sun's US reporter, senior reporter for the Sun in the US, indeed. I do think there's something in that. This kind of, right now, this vagueness that is the criticism levelled at Harris, actually, it could be strategic. Let's not forget, it's not been a long time that she's actually been the nominee, so kind of ramping up a policy platform from that point of view does take some time. But there is this sort of idea of Donald Trump, he calls her a communist and a lunatic, but voters don't seem to be kind of buying into that. He's kind of playing on a pro-criminal radical was something he's kind of trying to stick on her. But then she talks about her record as an actual prosecutor and, locking up criminals from days gone by. So the critiques aren't quite working.
I'm not sure Trump quite knows what is the best angle to go for at the moment. I think he's trying lots of different ones to see which ones land. Pip has got in touch saying, Chloe, I think you're forgetting that almost everyone listening to your show won't be voting in the American election. I'm not bothered about Kamala Harris's policy details, more the straight choice of Americans to vote for a sensible candidate or Trump. It's a valid point, Pippa. I just wonder if American voters feel the same way. Maybe it will come. Maybe, we've still got time, haven't we? A few months before Americans go to the polls. So maybe she'll decide over the course of the next month or so to do those interviews and be a bit more specific.
And there is always a fascinating part of US elections, which is perception from around the world versus perception within the US, which can often be really quite different things in terms of who you would back as a person in the UK, a voter in the UK, compared to the vast differences that you find in different states across the US as well.
And actually, doesn't matter what anyone around the world thinks for these two candidates. They need to just talk to their voters, don't they, at this point?